Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jen Riley, and I'm a Senior Transportation Planner at the Connecticut DOT in our agency's Sustainability and Resiliency Unit, and that's located within the Bureau of Policy and Planning. My job primarily is focused on reducing carbon pollution from the transportation sector, and I serve as the department's electric vehicle subject matter expert. I really just want to take a moment here to thank my colleagues at Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection for contributing info for this presentation, and to mention that they will be available along with DOT staff to help answer questions in the chat box as I go through the presentation. I'm really happy to see so many folks here, especially many familiar faces. So nice to see you all. Welcome. Today, I'm going to tell you about the work DOT has done on identifying the gaps in the EV charging network, especially along Connecticut's transportation corridors. So before I get started, I just want to remind folks of a couple of things. You might have heard the webinar is being recorded and the chat is public record. Please stay on mute to avoid disruptions. And if the presentation gets stopped for any reason, please rejoin using your registration link. The questions, you can put them in the chat box. We're going to be answering them throughout the presentation, and then we'll select questions at the end to go over. And if we don't get to your question, don't worry, we'll follow up afterwards. Right now we have 2 hours slated for this call. I don't anticipate we'll need it all, but just in case, it's there. So I've sat through many presentations where it sounds like alphabet soup when the presenter starts talking. I'm going to try not to do that, but just in case, I thought, being that this presentation is being recorded and it would be available later, I figured a list of acronyms might be helpful for everyone. So these are the key subjects that I will be covering during today's call. The federal goals around advancing electric vehicles and building a nationwide network of electric vehicle chargers. A view from the state's perspective on why planning for EVs is necessary. We're also going to go over what the current EV landscape looks like in Connecticut, then talk about what the fast charger analysis that we performed in-house, and then we're going to go over the key findings from that work. Then lastly, I will touch on the prospective funding opportunities that could help us build out a fast charging network. So President Biden, he's made it very clear that his administration is very intent on addressing climate change through federal policy measures. And by ensuring through the federal infrastructure bill, as known, we call it the IIJA, that there is dedicated funding in place that's aimed at building out EV charging infrastructure across the country. While at the same time, it's also working to improve the electrical grid and building climate resiliency, among many other things. Granted, you're probably going to hear me say this repeatedly during this presentation. The federal government is still working on the guidance related to many of these EV charging programs, so many of the actual investments that we might be talking about here today will be subject to federal guidelines. So the slide here is from the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, their modeling team, and it considers President Biden's goal to increase zero emission vehicle sales nationally by 50% by 2030. Yes. Note, it only applies to light duty passenger vehicles, but it shows that the OEMs, or the car manufacturers, are beginning to get on the zero emission bandwagon and are ready to produce more electric vehicles to meet mass market expectations. It also shows that the projected growth in the number of electric vehicles on the road will considerably impact our nation's grid, which really is a topic for another day, but something that our colleagues at PURA and at the utilities are working really hard to address. We recognize that this is a factor and that will go hand in hand with the uptick in EV adoption. Connecticut DOT really wants to ensure that we are aligned and we're ready to work with our state partners to ensure that any federal investments that come to Connecticut, or if other state dollars become available, that they make a meaningful impact on building and preparing for the EV revolution that is building momentum as we speak. So yeah, there is a strong possibility that federal money will be coming our way, and Connecticut needs to ensure that we are scaling up our electric vehicle supply equipment, such as our charging stations, especially our fast chargers, in order to encourage higher EV adoption. We talk about the EV revolution, and Connecticut agency staff and policymakers have spent considerable time and energy creating comprehensive strategies over these past few years for achieving widespread development of electric vehicles within our state. Back in 2020, DEEP launched Connecticut's EV Roadmap, which is a really great resource and provides a deeper dive than really what anything that I can cover within this webinar. But it covers what has been done in Connecticut over the last 10 years regarding EV planning. And it also lays out strategies to help meet the state's goal to increase zero emission vehicle adoption. If you haven't already checked it out, you should. I highly recommend it. I also want to mention that DEEP has an EV Connecticut program and website that works to educate the public on all sorts of EV related resources. On there, you can find out more information about Cheaper, the Connecticut incentive program, where you can get cash on the hood to purchase or lease a new or used plug-in electric vehicle. And you can also sign up on this webpage to get emails sent to you when new EV incentives or other EV programs are announced. For today's discussion, I'm going to just gloss over the top reasons why planning for EVs is necessary. We need to achieve our ZEV MOU goals. Connecticut is a signatory state to the ZEV MOU. It's like a pact of sorts between states, showing that we're working to advance electric vehicles. And Connecticut's goal under this Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is to put 125,000 up to 150,000 light duty vehicles on the road by 2025. We also need to work towards achieving 30% of our medium and heavy duty sales to be zero emission by 2030, with even a bigger goal of getting that number up to 100% by 2050. We also need to promote these clean vehicles, since electric vehicles, or EVs, have an electric motor instead of a combustion engine and tailpipe. No emissions are created by the act of driving an electric car. In Connecticut today, the average emissions from driving an electric vehicle are equivalent to driving a car that gets 82 miles per gallon. And we know that the emissions performance of electric vehicles is only going to improve as wind and solar power come online to displace coal-fired electricity generation. We also want to encourage energy independence. It's not a secret. Transportation remains resilient on oil as a dominant energy source, but EV drivers can charge at home at a cheaper and more predictable cost and not have to rely on what the price is at the pump. That's good, especially if you're a driver looking to save money. We also want to boost range confidence. Some drivers have anxiety and fear that an EV will run out of power before a destination is reached. But we expect this fear will diminish as consumers become more confident in charging accessibility and will lead to more people purchasing or leasing electric vehicles. We're also wanting to transition our state fleet to zero emission vehicles. Connecticut has a statutory mandate that 50% of the state's light duty vehicle purchases must be alternative fueled by 2030. We also need to meet Connecticut's statutory and Governor Lamont's executive order goals. In 2018, the Connecticut Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3, identified transportation electrification as critical for achieving the state's statutory required economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction targets. Yet in September of this past year, 2021, the state's annual greenhouse gas emission inventory was released, which looks at data through 2018. And in it, they found that Connecticut is not on track to meet the greenhouse gas emission goals set by the legislature. And they also found that transportation emissions, the blue line on this graph, are the main culprit. Even more discouraging is that transportation emissions are higher than they were in 1990, despite greater fuel efficiency in motor vehicles. We need to do better. So I hear all the time when I talk to people about electric vehicles, are they really cleaner than driving a conventional vehicle? I'll let the data speak for itself. This is an example of an emission breakdown comparing an electric vehicle to a conventional gasoline vehicle using Newington, Connecticut as the garage location of the vehicle. I included a link here at the bottom of the slide, so if you're interested in learning more about this and using it at your location, please feel free to do that. But as you can see from this tool, EVs have a smaller carbon footprint than gasoline cars, especially in Connecticut. And it's clear that we need these zero emission vehicles on the road to help us meet our state greenhouse gas reduction targets. Environmental goals. We know that Connecticut's transition to electric vehicles is an essential strategy toward our state's commitment to creating a cleaner, healthier, and more sustainable community, while also achieving our statewide clean air goals. As mentioned before, electric vehicles are zero or low emitting vehicles that produce no tailpipe emissions. This is really important because the transportation sector is the single largest contributor to the state's NOx emissions, a key component of ground level ozone, which makes smog. You can see that by looking at the graph here on the left. And also the 38% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions, we talked about that earlier, it's all coming from transportation. You can also see, looking at the image on the right-hand side of this slide, Connecticut is in non-attainment for the 2008 and 2015 ozone standards, and it's not projected to meet ozone standards in the future, given the current emissions control programs. Health impacts are important too, especially in dense urban environments, where air pollution from traffic is becoming a real concern for many residents. Exhaust emissions from fuel transport cause 53,000 premature deaths per year in the US alone, and are especially harmful to children, the elderly, and low-income communities. Wide-scale EV deployment will correspondingly drive reductions in harmful criteria pollutants and carbon from the transportation sector, help the state meet federal health-based air quality standards, and mitigate communities' exposure to mobile air source toxins. For so long, there haven't been many EVs to choose from when you go to buy or lease a car. And if they were, the range they could drive in electric mode was very limited, but that's changing. As you can see from this graph, showing the variety of vehicles on the market right now, Tesla is no longer the only company going all in on electric vehicles. If you look at the x-axis of this graph, many of the vehicles shown here have a range of 200 plus miles. I think it is also key to know that the General Motors is investing $35 billion over the next 5 years to build electric vehicles and autonomous vehicle technology. The company says it will introduce 30 all-electric models by 2025, which isn't far away, especially by auto industry standards. Ford has been marketing the all-electric F1 Lightning, I like to say it like that, and it recently revealed that $11.4 billion investment in battery and F-150 production. In total, the company expects to invest $30 billion in electric vehicles by 2025. And also on top of the big automakers, upstarts like Lucid, Rivian, Fisker, Nikola, and many others are either starting production or are getting close. Electric vehicles are at a tipping point in gaining market share, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. So how are we doing in the amount of electric vehicles driving around Connecticut? Information is from the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, and their analysis shows where in Connecticut the greatest amount of EV adoption is happening. DEEP is also able to track Connecticut-specific EV adoption on the county level, but we thought it was also nice to be able to evaluate where we are compared to other New England states. Massachusetts is still doing a little bit better if you look at these metrics than us, but the main point really that I want to emphasize here is that Connecticut's average market share is on par with the nation of 2.6% based on this analysis. And according to Connecticut DMV, as of January 1st of this year, 2022, there are 21,382 electric vehicles registered in Connecticut. And as that number grows, public fast charging connectors will be critical to supplement residential charging to meet future charging demands. All right, enough about the cars and talking about the reasons why there's a big push to get people into electric vehicles. Let's talk about the infrastructure. Here is a high-level overview of what exactly DC fast charger technology consists of. For a typical driver, you can expect to pull up to a fast charger and get 60 to 80 miles of range added to your vehicle in about 20 minutes. The cost of these fast chargers are typically much more expensive than a level 2 charger that you would typically see in your house or see at a workplace location. The fast charger costs that we have provided here are highly variable, depending on the potential required electrical upgrades, hardware, and labor costs. Both DOT and DEEP learned this during our fast charger pilot back in 2016, when we worked with our utilities to install several fast chargers. This slide also gives you a snapshot of the current number of fast chargers in our state, otherwise known as our existing system. To note, all the data in this presentation was pulled from the Department of Energy's Alternative Fuels database on August 11th of 2021. But I can tell you, not much has changed in this data in the last 6 months. That's why there's a real need to use our public resources to ensure that we can build out a fast charging system that is available for all, makes and models of electric vehicles out there, and a network that is reliable and convenient for all to access. So let's get to our analysis. From the start, I want to note that we didn't include any of Tesla's network into our analysis. There is talk that Tesla plans to begin opening its US network to all brands of electric vehicles to use, but we didn't want to rely on that happening right now, since right now they're still available to Tesla only vehicles. We initially made this map last July, and when we updated this year, we found very few additional CHAdeMO charge ports and or CCS units. And those are the connectors that go from the charger into the car. And most models use those. So like I mentioned before, the fast charger market ramp up is much slower than level 2 infrastructure build out. And many of the locations only have one publicly available charger per location. And these are indicated on this map with the blue stars. The green stars indicate where there are banks of 6 or more chargers per location. Only Stamford, Manchester, North Haven, Stratford, and Waterford have banks of 6 or more DC fast chargers at those locations. And in some instances, 3 chargers might be located on the southbound direction and 3 might be on the northbound direction. We use the green stars on this map as the basis of the analysis we performed. Important note, there is one location that has 4 stations near New Haven, and that's the red star on the map. I think it's important to note that we discovered during our analysis that Tesla, when they put their chargers in, they typically have banks of 4 to 12 chargers on average at each location, depending where it is. So this really shows that there are major gaps in our current fast charging infrastructure. there is potential that the federal dollars that are coming Connecticut's way may be prioritized to interstate highways that are already deemed signage ready and signage pending under federal highways existing alternative fuels corridor program. In federal highways alternative fuel corridor program, the requirement for a corridor to be approved by federal highway is that the EV charger needs to be available at 50-mile intervals along the designated EV corridor, and the station needs to be within 5 miles from the interstate exit. So on this map, you can see that the federal highway signage ready corridors are I-84, which is the New York border to the Massachusetts border, I-91 from New Haven to the Massachusetts border, I-95 from the New York border to the Rhode Island border. And these 3 corridors are important because they're part of a larger, more extensive multi-state corridor. For example, I-95, that corridor here in Connecticut, is also part of a larger corridor linking, starting in Augusta, Maine, going all the way down to Petersburg, Virginia. Also included in our signage pending is I-395 from Waterford to the Massachusetts border, and US 7 between the US 7 and I-95 interchange in Norwalk and New Milford. We do have one EV pending corridor, and that's indicated here on this map with the red line. It's US 7 from New Milford up to the Mass border. There's no chargers up there. So just looking quickly at this map, you can see we're a little light on 95 going towards Rhode Island and 395 going up from Massachusetts. Also 84 west of Hartford looks a bit sparse. When we started our analysis, the most logical place to start filling in the gaps was on our interstates to target the longer distance drivers. For this analysis, we use AADT, which is annual average daily traffic, and much traffic volume data. And we also use interstate data, and we plotted chargers 20 miles between locations along the interstate system. DEEP's EV roadmap recommended that there are at least 4 connectors per location, and all locations should be future-proofed to accommodate at least 8 connectors. And when we were talking to DEEP more in depth about this analysis, they recommended future-proofing for up to 10 connectors. So for our analysis, we're estimating at least 6 chargers a location, 20 miles apart. And what we found is that we would need at least 14 locations along the interstate to meet 20 miles between banks of 6 or more chargers, while also considering where our neighboring states, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, where their DC fast chargers were located. So here we are, we're trying to gauge how much additional coverage would we gain if we put a 1 and 5 mile buffer around each interstate. Going with the idea that ideally the public isn't going to want to travel far from the highway if they're looking for a charge. Looking at the 5 mile buffer, which is the blue color, it doesn't really capture many additional chargers that are already in the ground, like maybe like 5 additional chargers with 2 Tesla ones. And then if you look at the yellow line, that's the 1 mile buffer. It also doesn't include many other additional chargers into our analysis, but it might be a useful tool for future planning efforts. So if we're committed to ensuring that everyone is within a charge, then we need to look further than highways and interstates. We need to look at limited access roads. And those are roads that often connect rural areas to our metropolitan areas. DOT defines limited access roads as roads that pedestrians and bicyclists are not allowed on. We saw an opportunity to also include Route 6 going towards Rhode Island and Route 7 going north from Danbury on this map. And we also threw in Route 44 because it would also help connect residents traveling from the northwest section of the state into Hartford. The data we relied on for this map was using the green stars and the pink proposed locations, not shown on the map, as a baseline. We could start filling in the gaps. Our initial plan was to use 30 miles between these locations, but we ended up able to get around 20 miles between stations. The data we used here is the American Community Survey data from 2017. And this is vehicle availability data, which showed us locations where there were high numbers of people without cars. We also referenced AADT, the traffic volume data. And based on our analysis, we found if we invested in 11 locations, we would help cover EV charging for those Connecticut residents that may not necessarily utilize interstates on a regular basis. This is showing the 1 and 5 mile buffers along interstates and the limited access roads. The teal color indicates the 1 mile buffer and the purple indicates the 5 mile buffers. We clearly get most of the state covered by including these additional limited access roads in our planning, yet there's still a couple of gaps. So investing in locations with an equity focus is also a big area we're thinking about. If we look at the current fast charger infrastructure in place, there aren't many, if any, DC fast chargers in the denser populated cities. That being said, we know we should be cautious planning for charging within high density cities without getting the community's input. This analysis was solely based on data we had available, but we anticipate this could possibly help start conversations within these communities. The data sets we looked at include, we took the 21 most populated cities and towns in Connecticut, and we overlaid the American Community Survey data, income to poverty level data on top of it. And then we also use that American Community Survey vehicle availability data, which if you remember, were the locations where there were high numbers of people without cars. And then we also looked at bus routes and stops in each city to see if there were any gaps in public transportation options. 5 cities rose to the top of the list: Norwalk, Bridgeport, New Haven, Torrington, and Bristol. Torrington especially stood out because compared to some cities, they have a limited bus network. Bristol also stood out because there aren't many chargers in that area, and they could satisfy more than one need if we put some there. But this is just looking at it from a high level perspective. There's lots of opportunities for more. So our analysis boiled down to, we identified 30 locations to invest in fast charging. If we plan to install 6 chargers at each location and have the potential for future-proofing, possibly up to 10 per location, the cost would be approximately $15 million, about $504,000 a site. But of course, there are lots of other variables that need to be considered. These are the additional opportunities that have the potential to significantly impact the build out of EV chargers. And we had a hard time accounting for them in our analysis. So first off, the private sector is investing in electric vehicle charging. We have seen that with Dunkin' Donuts. They placed a charger in New Haven. Not a huge bank of chargers, but still it's helpful. Shell, the gas station company, is working with Aero Environment in California to get EV charging into gas stations. And there's the potential they'll work to do this across the country. Pura's EV charging program was launched in January of this year, and the program is a 9-year program administered by the utilities and designed to support the installation of EV charging infrastructure across Connecticut, with a particular focus on equity and inclusion. The EV charging program offers incentive structures, both the purchase of electric vehicle charging equipment and any associated electrical upgrades that are needed to put these chargers in. And they have certain participant eligibility requirements. And they are deploying these in 5 program areas or market segments. which one of the markets is fast charging, DC fast charging. Also, PURA is requiring the state's utilities to develop and publicly make available hosting capacity maps specific to the installation of level 2 and fast charging stations for both United Illuminating and Eversource territories. This will be key because it will show where underutilized circuits are and foster coordinated public-private and/or private investments in EV charging infrastructure. These maps will be an integral tool in helping to identify site selection. Electrify America. In June of last year, they came out with their Cycle 3 investment plan, and the state has been talking with them about their plans to build out fast charging within our state. They have several proposed site locations, including 1 to 3 sites, possibly split in between Bridgeport, Stamford, and Norwalk. Some sites possibly split between Hartford, East Hartford, or Middletown. So discussions are ongoing with them, but that we do have some sites we're working on with them. Also, the OEMs, the car manufacturers, General Motors have indicated they have an interest in putting in fast charging infrastructure in Connecticut. We haven't been able to get the specifics or particulars on where they're thinking, but they have started conversations. And then rumblings have been going on for some time that Tesla will be offering their superchargers for everyone. But we haven't heard any definitive plans that this is happening. So here are our key findings from our analysis. More EV fast chargers are needed statewide. This was not our big revelation, but this analysis did help us to narrow down where in the state it might be ideal to build EV chargers to help cover our existing gaps. Of course, there are additional tools out there that we can utilize to narrow down at more of a micro level where EV chargers should be put in the ground, like gas stations, shopping centers, where exactly we're going to put them. But our intention with this analysis was to get a broad overview of the state so that we could use this analysis as the basis for any future work. Engage with the public. This is really important. All of our analysis done to date was done using data that we had available to us, but it doesn't account for the human element of what people will use. And we really welcome opportunities to engage with everyone to understand what drivers would really like to see when it comes to fast charging across our state. So please let us know your thoughts. So we expect that when we get the federal IIJA guidance from the feds, that we will develop and set up an EV infrastructure development program for private sector build out of fast charging stations across the state. This will be done to ensure that the build out of fast charging meets the needs of everyone in the state. I imagine many folks here have been watching what has been happening in Connecticut's EV space over the past several years. And I'm sure you've recognized that across the state, many different entities have been exploring how best to utilize resources to expand publicly accessible EV charging. It may seem to outsiders that there isn't coordination happening across some of the state agencies, but that's not the case. DOT has been coordinating with our state partners at DEEP, DAS, and PURA, and we meet frequently to discuss transportation electrification related topics. We are collaboratively working together to develop a strategy to build out Connecticut's fast charging network. Like we mentioned earlier, PURA, under DACA REO4, has worked with utilities to set up the EV charging program that offers the incentive structure for both the electric vehicle charger and any associated electrical upgrades. You can find more information about this program on Eversource and United Illuminating's website. Also, Connecticut DEEP's Volkswagen NOx mitigation program. They have not announced what their electric vehicle supply equipment program opportunities will be, but folks should really sign up to make sure they're on their email distribution list so you can be notified right away when their programs come out. There's also the potential for over $53 million coming from the IIJA that will be coming to Connecticut over the next 5 years to support the expansion of an EV charging network. Granted, like I've mentioned several times, the guidance is still pending, and we don't want to get the cart before the horse, but at the same time, we need to be having more discussions, such as like we're having today, so that we can all work together to ensure that we both have clean electricity in place to power all these anticipated zero emission vehicles, and we have a plan to identify where these chargers need to be placed. So, what do we anticipate happening next? We anticipate Federal Highway to release more information about the IIJA state formula funding related to the build out of electric vehicle charging. We anticipate that will probably happen in mid-February, and really pretty much any planning going forward is going to pivot on what the guidance tells us. There's also going to be an opportunity for regions and local governments who are eligible to apply for a separate federal competitive funding program, but the timing of that is unknown. In anticipation of some of this other federal funding becoming available down the road, Connecticut DOT has set up a grant unit in our Office of Policy and Planning, and we'll be keeping a close eye on additional funding opportunities, especially related to EV charging as they present themselves. So really, this is an exciting time in Connecticut. We really welcome your thoughts on the work we've done thus far on this topic. How can we do better? What should we be thinking about? And what we haven't covered here today. All these are really important to us. So here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out if you need to. And I thought, since I had your attention and the fact we're talking about transportation, I thought I should put a plug in here to remind everyone to not look at your phone while driving. We all need to do our part to keep our eyes on the road and keep everyone safe. So thank you. And I think Emily's here to help with the questions.